because it was quite a revelation to me. And in fact, I'll go back to, I don't know where I'm going to start. Have you got me on?
Yep.
Right. Okay, so in about 2001 I went to Ethiopia to work on AIDS, because at that point in time people were dying of AIDS by the millions in Africa, and they still are, by the way, dying quite a lot, and it's not talked about anymore. But I talked to a woman who'd just come back from Sierra Leone, and she told me of 2 people who died recently, and she didn't know why, and she explained it to me, how they died, and I said, that's AIDS. And nobody was even paying attention to this. So 2 out of 2 people she knew who died of AIDS in Sierra Leone last month or 2. So I thought that was sort of interesting, given that no one's talking about it anymore. And what the situation then was that the drugs existed in the West, but they weren't getting to Africa because they were priced at something like $10,000 a time. So Africa wasn't getting any drugs. Although it only cost $100 a month, a year to make them, they were selling them for $10,000, so Africa didn't get them. So tens of millions of people died because they overpriced the drugs, which is sort of an interesting idea, I thought. So anyway, so I went there, and with the idea of trying to find a homeopathic solution to AIDS. And what I did was I sat in a clinic in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, the capital, and I'd arranged that I was only going to treat AIDS patients, because I knew that if I said I'll treat all comers, I'll have the whole of Addis on my doorstep, and I won't know what the hell's going on. And it was difficult enough as it was, because this is a country with 81 languages, 210 dialects, and no money. And I was paying my way rather than the other way around. So, and the interpreter was pretty poor, and so getting information out of someone was like sort of this low definition, you might say. You're lucky if you understood if anybody understood anything. So anyway, I did what homeopaths are supposed to do, which I took lots of people's cases who had AIDS, and I actually tried to treat them in a very simple way to start with, because I had no experience of treating AIDS before. Because in the West I didn't get any patients with AIDS. So what I saw was that very simple homeopathy worked. I just sort of looked at them. I used my skills, high levels of observational skills, to work out which sort of homeopathic archetype they might be, and gave it to them. And if I gave it to them something a little bit every day, it often worked, which gave me great hope, because up to that point I've never heard of anybody getting any results with AIDS anywhere in the world with homeopathy. So that was my first step. And by doing this I accumulated sort of 70 cases of AIDS, and I mean these were people on death's door and close to dying, and if they could walk in, they had at least 3 months to live, and if they were carried in, they only had a month to live. And if you didn't chew something, there was no drugs, so if I didn't do something, they would die, literally. You get the idea. This is not your average homeopathic practice or any medical practice. This is where everybody's destined to die in the next year. So, and there would be a queue every morning. Once the word got out, people were travelling from all over Ethiopia to see me, which I was slightly amazed by too, because it takes several days to travel across Ethiopia. There's no real transport systems, there's little buses, and you go from one to the next, to the next, to the next. And and what I began to realise was that although homeopathy had a fantastic track record in treating epidemic diseases, and that's the reason it was on the map at all, if it hadn't been successful in treating cholera and such like diseases in the 19th century, it wouldn't have been around. It would have died out probably. That was where it got its sort of kudos, because the rich and the famous and the upper classes and the king and the queen and all those people used it, and the people who used it stayed alive. And the death rates without homeopathic treatment was something like 30%, and with homeopathic treatment in typical epidemic diseases in the West were something like 1%. So like a 30-to-1 ratio, and tens or hundreds of thousands of these cases have been registered and recorded, and it's all in the books, so to speak. So that's why homeopathy. Well, on the other hand, they treated epidemics by let's say it was an influenza of 1918 where 20 million people died or more around the world. With homeopathy, they would select one of maybe 5 remedies according to the situation of the patient. Detox, bryonia, Eupatorium perforatum, gelsemium, and one other, let's say. These are just common homeopathic remedies, and according to the situation of the patient, you select it, they get better. And a pretty reliable system. It took 5 or 6 remedies to cover an average epidemic. Well, I couldn't afford that luxury. You've got a situation where there's no homeopaths except in South Africa. You've got 500, 600, 700 million people, and you've got tens of millions sick, and only one who knows how to operate the system I'm trying to work out. So it's got to be one remedy so that it works for everybody. And what I realised was, because I'd never done this sort of work before, was that nobody had ever discovered a single remedy in homeopathy for any disease ever. Any epidemic disease, let alone chronic disease. But so, this may not seem relevant to your complaints, but you have to understand. I'm just explaining where I'm coming from. So, when I really dawned on me the impossibility of the task I had, and yet I could see that homeopathy worked, I sort of decided to, and I had really good homeopathic software. We have a lot of stuff. We have enormous data banks. We have a lot of information which is well recorded from 2.5 centuries, and it's accurate and reliable, and it works. You know? But I realised that even with the best software in the world, I couldn't find any answer. I wasn't going to get one. And I came to England and I emailed around and I talked to people and I said, look, this is what I found. You got any bright ideas? And everybody had a bright idea, but none of them were appropriate. So I went back to Ethiopia after Christmas in 2001. Was it 2002? I went there in 2001. I went back in January after a few weeks in England talking to people. And I decided on a different tack, which was to what I would call reverse engineer. I knew the total picture of AIDS. I got it right. I had it right. It corresponded to what the medical profession said. It corresponded to my experience of the patients I had. And just wondering if I tell you little stories of these people, but I think probably best not to traumatise you. They were pretty traumatic, some of these stories, so I'll just stay away from that. But anyway, I saw that what I realised was that I understood the big picture of AIDS in terms of homeopathic, and I saw it corresponded on a physical level to what the medical profession have found out as well. You know, but you know, homeopaths think psychologically fundamentally, they don't think physically, that's a consequence. So I was looking at the psychology of it as well and trying to work it out, and I had seen I was not going to get anywhere. So then what I did was I took the total information of AIDS and I reversed it into a bottle. I'll tell you I did that later, and that was like something that had never been done before. Normally in homeopaths they go from a plant to a bottle, you know, they take it from a plant, they dilute it and bang it and scrape it and do all sorts of things, but it ends up in a bottle, and it's the energy of the plant without the plant. Or it's the energy of the salt without the salt, or it's the energy of an animal venom without the venom. But it's basically something from nature in a bottle. And I realised that method wasn't going to work because, well, there was no way I couldn't see how I could find it. So I did the opposite, and I started giving it to these patients. And after 2 weeks, people started coming back. Maybe it was a month, but 2 weeks, something like that. Me having treated them, they came back 2 weeks later. And one morning, 5 people turned up, and they said things like, well, the last treatment was good, but this is the real thing. Now, I've worked in many different cultures. I've worked in 20 countries, and I've worked in what I call peasant communities, where people are what they say they are. And I don't mean it in derogatory terms. It means when they say something, they mean it. It's the truth. It's not intellectualized, you know. Whereas if you work in California and someone's got a bad need, it will take them 5 sentences before you establish it's actually the need that's in pain. I have a mobility problem, you know, and I have some intellectual abstraction about that. And you have to drill down to the hard fact, whereas in a peasant culture they just tell you as it is. So when this woman said to me, this is the real thing, I knew what she meant that that was really working. And what she meant was, I feel completely better. I feel better in my soul. I feel like what I was before the illness started, and I'm getting better in all ways, and the energy's coming back and things. And they all started telling me the same story. So this medicine that I've made, or remedy that I've made, worked dramatically well. And that took me a lot of believing, because I, so to speak, reversed it into the bottle by a spiritual bottle, conscious process, by a conscious making process. So what I did was, is a long time before this, maybe 15 or 20 years before, I'd got myself a guide, a spirit guide, not a spirit guide in the Native American tradition or something like that, but something. One that I recognised and knew and could never speak to. Just was always there if I wanted to talk to them. I couldn't talk to them, but if they were always there, and I didn't know what they were for. So they hung around me for 15 years. And I had this, how I got this connection, I don't know. But I said to them, I need this bottle to contain this information. And left them to it. And I said, this is the time, this is the one, this has to happen. If you can help me now, this is it. If you can't, then I've had it, you know, I've got no money left to carry on this type of work. So, and I'm not a sort of guy who talks in any sort of fanciful terms in these situations. I'm just plain common sense, and I speak like this to them, to him, or it, or her, or whatever it is. So, and I designated the bottle where I wanted it. I put it on the shelf and I left it to cook. I didn't know how long cooking would take. I had no idea because I'd never done it before, but I think it took about a week. I forget, I didn't make notes. You can see how. And this turns out to be the biggest decision I ever made in my life, by some margin, I have to say. So, I kept trying it, and I kept seeing that it worked. And it was unbelievable, because this is out of my range of understandings, and even if I could do a little bit of channeling or something, you know, normally that's not so accurate and not this and that, and I've never done anything like this, and it carried on working. And it's worked now for at least 10 or 12 years. I sent supplies to various homeopathic pharmacies around the world, and they've, you know, sent it out to people all over the world, and at least 10,000 people are alive because of this, just that alone, and who would certainly be dead, you know, if they hadn't received it. And it may be, just for example, we talked to one guy who was a pastor from a church in, let's say, Kenya, and he took us an hour to train him, half an hour to tell him about it, and half an hour to tell him what to do and give him the kit. And he went off and treated 1,000 people before we even heard any more. And it's dead easy, you know, you just take a...
The pastor who sang.
Yeah, so he treated 1,000 people before he came back to us and said, you know, this stuff works, you know. And the churches are actually a very good way to go through Africa, because they've got the best networks. But anyway, here's a story from, so early on I went to South Africa with this, and I got into the Durban Times. I had a 2-page spread, genius or madman, it said. And she was a very sympathetic reporter, but she knew the politics, so she had to put it like that, otherwise I wouldn't have got in the paper. And I was staying in a bed and breakfast sort of place, and I gave the address where I was, and hundreds of people turned up alongside the swimming pool. I was dispensing hundreds of copies of this stuff all over South Africa. Anyway, some black guy, took it to an AIDS hospice down in Durban, down in Cape Town, I think, or somewhere. Anyway, somewhere there was an AIDS hospice, and in this hospice there were like 30 beds. And every day one person died, and someone else came in to fill the bed. So 30 beds, one person dies a day of AIDS. And that was typical of what was going on. Even in Ethiopia, no one in the government or anybody in any offices worked in the afternoons, because they spent the mornings at work and the afternoons at funerals. That's what it was like. People were just dying like flies all the time. So he took it into this AIDS hospice, and he gave all the patients in this hospice a bottle of this stuff you know, which didn't only cost, this is the cost of a bottle of mineral water, basically. And after 1 week, one person died. And after that, nobody died. And after a month, they started going home. But the key thing that really upset this guy who did it was after 3 days, he rang me up, he said, they're hungry. Yes. Well, they've got no budget for food because people dying of age can't eat. They've got the thrush going right down their throat, their mouth, their throat into their stomach, so the appetite's completely gone. And they just can't eat at that point. So suddenly they came alive and they needed food. And they're hungry as a dog then, as they describe it. I've got an appetite like a dog. I want to go, wow, wow. You know, literally, they describe it like a dog. So I said, well, give them some money then. Feed them, you know. And, you know, he hadn't expected this small hiccup. But anyway, that was one example. So fast forward 10 years to a hospital in Kenya, I think. And there's a woman doctor there with a hospital, and she's got a ward of 11 people who are all AIDS, and they're dying. And they're on the drugs, and they're still dying, see, because the drugs they give in Africa, whereas in the West, if you've got AIDS, roughly speaking, every few years, you have to go on to a new set of drugs because you haven't followed the protocol, or you become immune to them, they don't work anymore, and they put you on a more expensive set. And you stay alive by going through different sets of the drugs. They don't do that in Africa, they give them one set once. And unless they follow the protocol very reliably, they're not going to work for very long. They're going to extend life a few years if you're lucky. So but the doctor had my remedy, but she never used it, and she was very suspicious of it, obviously. And so finally, in desperation, she gave everybody in her ward one dose once, and every one of them but one walked out and went home. And these were dying from the drugs, with the drugs, you see. So this is just examples of how this works. So it appears that even just one dose of this would work. So that was my introduction to how, and I would never have gone down this path if I hadn't done this crazy step of making a remedy through a conscious connection. And the guy I talked to doesn't actually make them. You know, he's just a telephone operator. And he's got a source going back up to a source of God knows where in this beyond universes of universes, and it comes back down into the bottle. And I'm the creative guy on, and the way it works is I'm the partner down here on planet Earth, standing here. I do the physical delivery system, which is organise the bottles and the pharmacies and what it's for, and I think up ingenious ways of using it for ingenious things, you know, for all sorts of things. But I have no understanding of how this works. I mean, I could try and persuade you I do, but I don't. If you should know. But what I do know is it's very reliable. I formed my first rule about this once I got going on it, which is it always works. Like it's 100%. And my colleague and I, my friend is called Harry van der Zee, he's a doctor, and he and I work together. And he came to the conclusion, like I did, it always works. And in homeopathy, nothing always works. In conventional medicine, nothing always works. This always works. So it's a whole new ball game, which we hadn't realised at the beginning. I hadn't realised that I created a whole new paradigm for medicine, life in general, as far as I can see. So I've got distracted, but I've got to get back to that. So yeah, what I found in Ethiopia was sometimes about a quarter of the patients didn't get better straight away. And having formed the rule, it always works, then I just said, okay, tell me what's not happening. Have you taken it? You know, show me the bottle. Have you taken it? Well, very occasionally, they just drank the whole thing in one dose, you know, and didn't take it. Or they didn't even take it anymore than when I demonstrated it. But occasionally they were having sex with somebody who had terminal AIDS, and they were getting a dose of sperm every few days, which were loaded up with the virus, so they were getting fully reinfected. So that didn't work. But the most common thing was they had nothing to eat. And you know, in the West, you don't have patients who don't have nothing to eat. It just doesn't happen. So I figured out that €1 would feed them for 2 weeks in local currency, obviously. So I gave him 2 weeks of money and said, you're not to spend it on the kids, the husband, the wife, or anybody else, just you. Feed yourself, and in 2 weeks you'll have enough energy to work. And this is what used to happen. And it would work. And generally speaking, they would be better in 2 weeks. They would go from no energy, which was like walking 5 meters and feeling worn out, and having no appetite and totally tired and wasting away, to eating ferociously, all their energy coming back. They could walk 15 kilometers, work all day, 15 kilometers, uphill in Ethiopia this is, so 15 miles or something, 10 miles, work all day physically, doing some physical job, and then walk home again and cook the meal, and that's what happened after 2 weeks. So it was a total transformation. I'm not talking about, I feel a bit better, doctor, this was total stuff. So that's how I came to believe this, but it still took me 2 years to believe it. I had to go, I went from country to country across Africa, demonstrating it, showing it, teaching people, and I still doubted it. I just still couldn't believe this system. It's insane. So I think it's like beyond any sort of belief structure I ever had. So that's how I got into this. And since then we treat malaria very reliably. And also we noticed that with malaria, for example, it stops people getting malaria. So it's both curative and prophylactic. In other words, it's an alternative vaccination. So it's the first thing that's ever worked to protect people against malaria in Africa. And we use it for TB, and we use it for gonorrhea, and any other obvious diseases that they have in Africa. And it's highly effective. So then I was called into Rwanda I went to Rwanda to treat AIDS, but my head went, this is in, let's say 2005, and it was about 10 years after the genocide there. And I figured, well, you can't treat people with AIDS just when they've got genocide trauma going on as well. You can't ignore this. Then I did a bit of checking out, and I realised that it was like genocidal trauma, as of Rwanda type, they describe it as if it happened yesterday, which means that if they engage their brain, it's like the goal on television, they replay the goal and the goal and the goal. The trauma of what happened 10 years ago comes back as if it's fresh, as if it happened yesterday. And it's only by having their good minds can they push it away. And if they haven't got a well-developed mind, they can't push it away, and any thinking goes straight down the track of the trauma. So they're totally incapacitated for more 10, 20 years sometimes, 10 years in this situation, from the trauma. They've got no ability to function. So I made a remedy for trauma, for genocidal trauma, and as well as the one for AIDS. And people were, I had 30 people, and I walked into this workshop they set up for me, and they expected me to treat 30 people with genocidal trauma, which I'd never treated before, from day one, that moment, and they wanted everybody to simultaneously take it and see what happened, which was an insane idea. But since it was set up, I did it, because I'm a sort of courageous sort of guy who just hangs in there. So they all took it, and they made me take it first because they were suspicious, which of course sent me off someplace. But anyway, and they all reacted to this remedy for genocidal trauma. And one of them abreacted, which is, you know what that is, but they did, as if it was happening to them physically. It's the same thing that whatever happened to them when they were being clubbed and cut to death, they went back into. But fortunately, there's a woman there who understood it, and they put something in her mouth to stop her biting her tongue off, and generally kept her functioning. Then I had 30 people, and a whole bunch of them went off into one corner and cried and laughed their heads off. They were hysterical. And a whole other bunch went to sleep immediately, which they never do. And by next morning, everybody was basically better after 10.5 years in this trauma. Which again, you know, sort of, I was surprised. And I checked it out, and there was one guy, for example, who had lost the use of his left eye because he'd obviously been clubbed on the head from behind. He didn't even know what happened to him because someone just clubbed him, knocked him out for dead. That's why he was alive, because he'd been knocked out and left for dead. So they didn't bother cutting his heads off or whatever, cutting his throat. They just left him. And you could see there was a big bruise on all this side of the face. So after I treated him, and his eye was white, as if he'd you know, everything that what is just atrophied in the eye or given up. And 10 days later, his sight came back. Well, you never see that in Europe. These guys have got vitality, but you know, his sight came back and his headaches, his permanent headaches disappeared, etc. You know, that's fancy having a headache for 10 years. Can you imagine that? With nothing for it. Anyway, so I realised this stuff worked for trauma as well as it worked for, you know, serious epidemic diseases. So from there onwards, I realised I've got a powerful new system of treating people in Africa. I have to say, in Africa, people have amazing vitality. We don't see it in the West because we're all depleted in all sorts of ways, and we're all overeducated, and we've inherited enormous trauma which we don't understand or recognise in the places. You know, where, if by comparison to an African village, which might have vitality of 100, the average person here might be down at 10. You see, and there's just no comparison, so you get dramatic results with homeopathic-like remedies there. So it's a brilliant place to learn how to do this stuff. If I'd have tried it in the West with AIDS, I wouldn't have got anywhere. It wouldn't have been anything like the same story. So, anyway, if I move on a bit to, you okay? Yes, I better stay in. So, what I realised then, I started thinking about chronic diseases in the West. You know, because actually, you know, this stuff pretty interesting, but nobody in the East, in the West, is interested in what I could do in Africa because it doesn't compute to the people in the West. So anyway, so what I realised was when I analysed it, well, I have to tell you something else. There's a field of, I don't know if you've ever come across homeopathy, but in homeopathy we have a concept called miasms, which is stuff inherits down the family line. It means that if there's TB in the family history, if you're Irish, for example, you've almost certainly got an inherited limiting pattern from TB. It's just automatic. And if you're Jewish, Russian Jewish, you've got syphilis. And also, you know, you can trace these things, they're inheritable. But this was always poo-pooed by the medical profession because miasms is a weird theory. But they finally, in the last 20 years, discovered what's called epigenetics. So you know about genetics, which is we're made of genes. But epigenetics tells how each gene works. And each gene is like, well, in my simple way of doing it, genetics is 22,000 keys on a keyboard, and they can all be played in our lives. And epigenetics determines how well those keys work. So if you translate that to, say, eyesight, genetics gives you blue eyes, but epigenetics says how well your eyes work. You get it? It's that simple. So, and epigenetics are influenced by traumas in the history. This is obvious family constellation sort of understanding and homeopathic understanding, but traumas pass down the generations. So do toxins. They've done the research, you know, you can have toxins passing down 15 generations. So lead, the reason they've taken lead out of petrol is because it's highly toxic. But the generation like me, we're all filled with lead because we were brought up on lead. We were brought up on, you know, living by roads with lead everywhere. So, and the Alzheimer's and that sort of stuff of today is basically, as far as I can see, lead poisoning is systemic. I might be simplifying it, but it's something like that. And we also inherit disease traits, which has not been recognised by the medical profession yet, but the homeopaths have known it for 250 years. So these are the forming forces of chronic diseases, but chronic along with the toxins in the environment. So all these things are epidemic effects. They're not. So a chronic disease is really the outcome of a selection of epidemic effects coming down the generations. It's not, and if you look at chronic diseases, they're always slow moving. They're like slow epidemics. They gradually come upon you. So they are in fact an epigenetic phenomena, and they pass down the generations. So this, in principle, then, what I discovered for AIDS and malaria also applies to chronic diseases because they're just the effects of, they're a long-running epidemic coming together of several different strands all coming together and weaving itself into, say, diabetes or cancer or arthritis or whatever it happens to be. So I made remedies, started making remedies for such like diseases.
In the same way, Peter?
In the same way, absolutely. I've only got one method of manufacture, it's the same way. I just ask them, I tell them what I want, and I supply the bottle with the neutral liquid in it, the alcohol and water, which is the base of homeopathic remedies, and they make it happen. So then so this system, now I have pharmacies, the pharmacies that I supply have got sort of 300 remedies in them for a wide range of different chronic diseases in the West. So, and homeopaths then use them in addition to their normal ways of practice. When they've got stuck on a case, for example, they've tried the obvious and it doesn't work. We could have a discussion about this. You two could anyway. We could have various discussions of why normal homeopathy doesn't work in a chronic disease. And sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. So this is something else they can add in because it deals with the actual disease, which is something homeopaths don't normally like to do. They're not keen on treating diseases, but I've given them a new set of remedies which cover diseases. And, you know, and we get some amazing results sometimes, results that have never been seen before, like Parkinson's reversing. Now, no neurologist has ever seen a Parkinson's case reverse, as far as I understand it, but actually, we've had 3 independent reports from 3 different Parkinson's neurologists, so to speak, telling us that they've never seen this before and what happened, you know. And so all sorts of things are now possible, probably, that were not possible before, which is sort of interesting. Or not possible by normal homeopathic methods. I'm not saying that homeopathic methods are the be-all and end-all how you treat diseases. I'm just saying this is what's now, we've improved the system. So then my thought processes went to this problem what's happened between 2000 and 2010. We had lots of alert problems about SARS outbreaks and all sorts of outbreaks. We've got one about Ebola at the moment happening in Africa. And we've got this thing called the Centre for Disease Control, the CDC, whose whole job is to fly out people in white suits and masks to anywhere where there's trouble and shut it down as fast as possible, because they know that if something gets loose, it's all over, because they know they won't ever produce the drugs in time to treat it. And epidemics that are severe go around the world in roughly 12 weeks from beginning to end, and millions die in the process. And if a bad flu took off now, you would lose, you know, probably 100 million people in the world would die in a matter of 12 weeks. So there's no way that the present medical system can cope with that. It would cause a total panic and shutdown. Just imagine this, flu starts somewhere, let's say in Asia, in a pig or somewhere, a piggery, and the flu transmits into people. It gets around the world in 2 weeks before anybody gets symptoms. So everybody's infected without knowing it, because it goes, once it's on an airplane, it's everywhere, you know, in a week, in a day. And so then the incubation period goes on while everybody gets infected. And then suddenly it starts to break out and all hell breaks loose. The supermarket's empty, everyone bolts home and shuts the front door, except they've taken the disease in with them. And there's no delivery system that can cope. So I thought about this and I thought, I need to transfer my technology from pills and drops to downloads, to MP3 files, bits of music. Because as far as I was brought up as an electronics engineer, so I'm very happy with electronics. I'm not very happy with chemistry on a good day. Don't like the stuff, don't believe in it. I think chemistry is basically electromagnetic, sort of, with a bit of... Anyway, so I made a remedy for the flu. I started making remedies using MP3 files, and of course the great advantage is you can just stick them on a website and you can just email them to people. So if a flu broke out, and I've done this already, I have a website where I put the flu download on the website for free. It takes a minute to listen to, and you can just download it and listen to it, and it should not only treat it, but it should stop you getting it. So either stop you getting it or treat it or both. And that would work. And that's the only thing I can see that would ever work in a worldwide epidemic. Nothing else will work, because the drug lead time is at least 6 months. And the first doses out will go to the rich and the famous and the important. And the bottom of the pile, most people won't get it, even if it does work, which I doubt. So that's what switched me over to thinking about doing it with downloads rather than pills. But of course, that again goes against everybody's, well no, goes against the conventional wisdom. People hated the idea of downloads instead of pills. I mean, that's another no-go area, but as I said, I'm much more familiar with that. So we've had success. We've been operating websites now for maybe 7 years or so, treating people for all sorts of diseases, and people buy the downloads for a small fee and they use them for all sorts of things, and all sorts of things get better, which didn't get better before, interestingly now. You know, the other options didn't work so well. Just simple things like herpes, on the mouth, You listen to a download and it goes away. Lots better than the previous treatments. So,
in the West as well as
in the West, yeah. I'm not talking Africa now. At the moment, I've just put up a site which is called African Boosters for Africa. Africans like the term booster, and the idea is they can go to a site and they can listen to a download for their disease. And what we're aiming to do is to get a bit more proof that it works in terms of downloads in Africa, although I've done the work, I know it works, but I need more cases. And then we're going to go to a mobile phone company and get them to put it up as a feature for their mobile phones, because there's 400 million mobile phones in Africa. And they can just, you've got a bad cough, that's TB, ring this number. Got malaria, or relapsing fever, that's malaria, ring this number. And got weakness and loss of appetite, that's AIDS, ring this number. And you could just do that for a few times, it would be done, you see. And that seems like an elegant solution to the whole problems of Africa. And that would revolutionise Africa. Of course, it is completely contrary to any scientific belief structures and all the scientific medicine and all that stuff, but that's just how it is. So, we have to be clever, we have to box clever and not tell people the wrong, not shout too loudly in the wrong places so that we don't get into trouble and all that sort of thing. So it's a whole political sort of dance to avoid confronting all those. The biggest industry in the world, just about, is the pharmaceutical industry. So that's one we have to sort of wonder about. And anyway, so I think I've got that far, yes. So having proved that downloads work, my most recent invention is something I'll tell you about, which is a thing called Detox downloads. Because I realised that one of the biggest problem on planet Earth, as far as Westerns are concerned, is toxicity of the mind and the body. You may think toxicity of the body is a problem, but toxicity of the mind is far more important. But anyway, we have stuff like, we have parasites. Parasites are the biggest killers on Earth, and yet not much is done about it. And there's hundreds of them, there's at least 50 that are serious problems for people. And the problem is that you can't, with a homeopathic approach, go at parasites one at a time. Because let's say if there's 50 and you don't know what a person's got, you can't go say, okay, take this pill this week, this pill next week, this pill next week, and it doesn't work. And it might be that you could put various pills in bottles in combinations and that would work, but that's still a bit laborious and complicated and painful and expensive. So what I figured is that actually the body responds in a few tenths of a second to the information it needs to deal with a parasite. Well, let me just go back a bit. I don't know if you know the story of giraffes, but let me tell you about giraffes. Giraffes have very long necks, and the reason they have long necks is because they eat, doing that they can eat off the top of trees where no one else can get to, which gives them an assured food supply. So this process of how they got long necks was an intelligent adaptation. You have to forget Darwin, he got it mostly wrong. There was a Frenchman before him called Lamarck who got it mostly right, but Darwin was more materialistic, so his argument won the day, but actually Lamarck got it right and Darwin got it at least half wrong. So giraffes adapt, their necks got longer as an intelligent adaptation to survival, which got them into a unique place where they got a food supply no one else could get to. The trees, on the other hand, had a problem with giraffes. So what they do, when the giraffes come across to the clump of trees and start eating off the top, immediately they eat the first leaf. The tree notices this is happening and it starts to change the chemicals in the leaf so it goes bitter. And within 5 minutes it's gone bitter. Not only that, it tells all the other trees around the same information. So when this group of giraffes survive, they know they've only got 5 minutes to eat before the food's finished. By this, and then they have to run off to another bunch of trees somewhere else, or trot across the, So by this method, the trees stay alive and don't get eaten to pieces. The giraffes get a regular food supply, at least a mouthful or two before they've got to move on, a few mouthfuls before they move on. And everybody, and so the giraffes would normally, otherwise would just eat the tree dry probably. So this method preserves the trees and it preserves the food for the giraffes, and everybody's happy. It's a win-win situation. And this is scientific stuff I'm telling you about, how the trees, how the leaves go bitter and how they communicate. They've measured all this scientifically and observed it and such like. So I'm not inventing this out of my sort of weird position. So what I'm saying is that there's a consciousness going on everywhere. There's everything that happens on this world is a conscious process. It's an intelligent, loving, conscious process. So when I say to you that disease is a conscious, living, loving, intelligent process, disease is actually, when we have a chronic disease, oh no, I'm going back again. In Africa, we were sort of curious, we've got the idea that this is an intentional disease and it's got a purpose. The epidemic disease, AIDS, was a purpose. But the problem with AIDS is it kills off the parents when they're about 30. They get married, let's say they have sex at 15 or 20, between 15 and 20. They get infected, let's say, at 18. They then have 5 or 6 or 7 kids. And then by 30, AIDS is a stealth infection, it takes 10 years to show up. And in the 11th year, it kicks in. And you start dying at speed. And before that, nothing much happened. So these women and men are like 30, and they've got AIDS, and they've got 5 children who are dependent on them, or 7, or whatever. So it absolutely kicks in and kills off the parents. That's what AIDS does, it takes out the parents. So there were billions, well not billions, but tens of millions of AIDS orphans. Now it wasn't such a problem in Africa because the family is very extensive and the family prides itself in looking after all the kids. Some parents died, other parents took over. It was just, what you do. But it ended up with vast quantities of grandparents who hadn't got AIDS looking after their grandchildren. And you found this often, I saw, well, I won't go there. So we wanted to know why, if AIDS is intelligent, why is it killing off the parents? It struck us as an important question. We wanted to have this discussion. So we found a homeopathic shaman in the States who could do the journey, who knew how to do the journey into a virus. She'd never done it before, but we said we wanted to go and see the AIDS virus and have a conversation. I know it seems like a simple thing to say, but it took all her skills and she literally had to risk her life every time she did this sort of journey because she might not come back. That was her understanding. So she went in there and she had the conversation and she'd write it to us by email and send it to us by email and we'd read it. We'd understand something, we'd ask some more questions, she'd go back and we'd get information. And by this method we discovered what AIDS is really about and what the virus is about. And the first, I should have brought my book tonight, I've written a book about this. I'm very good at publicity and I forget to do things. Actually, there might be some in the back of my car. That's right. Okay, yes, there might be one in the back of my car, so in case you want to look at it, please, or something. So, what the reality is that and then after this we spoke to lots of viruses. I mean, we did shamanic journeys into them and tried to find out what goes on. And it appears that viruses and bacteria do not understand the human race as 7 billion individuals. They see the human race as one entity. It's only us who have the delusion of individuality. So, we're naive. We just don't know how we operate. We don't know how the human race works at all. They do. So their job, they're like very ancient, wise beings whose job it is to look after the health of the human race. So when they give a disease to a group of people, it's got real purpose to it and intention, which is to help the survival of the human race in total over time. So with AIDS, for example, with gay guys, the meaning of AIDS might be something like deepen your relationships, because there was a lot of superficial stuff amongst gay guys in the early days in terms of relationships. They were swapping partners all over the place. And of course they were the most susceptible to getting AIDS, so the message would be, wake up folks, deepen your relationships. In Africa, it's still about sex, but it's more to do with the women saying no when they choose to, and the men not expecting yes if they ask. So it's about the equality of the sexes. This is our conclusion about it, just in being simple about it, but there's more to it than that, but it was about equalising the rights of men and women in Africa through sex, if you see what I mean. So, yeah, so from this process we gradually understood, me and the rest of us who were working on this, that diseases are incredibly profound intelligences. And it was only if we, and we had conversations with them, like, well, what happens if we make a remedy, supply our remedy? Well, basically, what they said was, you can take over our role, if you're willing to. We're happy to retire, but you have to do a better job than we're doing. In other words, we have to make the conscious leap. The learning of the disease, in treating the disease, the learning of the disease, the conscious and purpose of the disease has to be fulfilled. You can't just slap the disease down and go back to what it was like before. You've got to have the evolution of the consciousness, the meaning of the disease, otherwise it's just going to repeat itself. So that's what we also learned. So we had to rely on our source giving us the necessary intelligence so that the disease purpose was fulfilled. If that didn't happen, we were screwed. So, just trying to get into my thinking about all these things. So that led me on to the fundamental point, which is on the leaflet, which is disease is an intelligent process. And every disease is a communication from ourselves to ourselves. We are doing it to ourselves, near enough. We are a walking history book, generating a problem inside ourselves to wake us up to the problem that we're not addressing. It's that simple. And it's a very kind, loving, intelligent, conscious process, conscious making process. And it's absolutely kind, loves us to bits. But we have to try and make the conversation. So, but knowing this bit of information is the first step. Once you know that, it gives you enormous power to start rethinking the whole paradigm of disease. And the second thing is you need to know is that every situation has in it the seeds of its resolution. So whatever disease you've got, you don't need any more information than what you've got. In it is everything that you need to facilitate that process. Every situation contains within it its resolution. Because it's a kind and intelligent universe or loving universe, we never get a situation which is beyond our capacity to manage, you see. So, once you know that, if you've got a disease, you can dance your way out of it, you can draw your way out of it, you can photograph your way out of it, you can garden your way out of it, you can cook your way out of it, you can do anything, but you've just got to have in mind, facilitating the conversation that's going on. You've already generated the disease, now you need to talk to it and learn what it wants to say so that you can resolve it. It's that simple. I don't know if I have anything else really to say.
You're talking about parasites, and
Yeah.
then you can go back to that.
I didn't go back to parasites. Ah yes, I've invented my detox downloads. Yes, so I realised, I've gone off, thank you. My brain, I haven't got a plan for tonight, I'm just going straight through. So the detox download site I've invented allows us to detox 60 parasites in 3 minutes by listening to a thing. Every 3 seconds I tell it another bit of information. And that was why I was going through the camels, not the camels, the giraffes. It's like, you see, the plague, just go back, thank you, you're very good. The plague was something that we all are, we're the ancestors of the plague. And we never had a vaccination for the plague. We survived the plague. We are survivors of the plague. We're the survivors of the plague. So, the body, the human race probably took 200 or 300 years to work out how to survive the plague. You see? Well, so evolution's a bit slow in these situations. So what I realised was that actually all we're doing is giving information to the body-mind as to what evolution would give it in several hundred years. We can give it in 3 seconds. And once it's got that information, it knows what to operate on and it knows what to do. And you can sit around and wait and let the human race half die out from an epidemic, or you can just learn quick and get on with it. Move on. So, and it only takes a few seconds to program in a new bit of information into the brain, mind, or whatever you like to call it. So, I've invented a system of detox which goes through 60 chemicals, 60 parasites, all the forms of electrosmog from radar to Wi-Fi, all the forms of inherited disease effects, and it goes through a whole bunch of, what else does it go through? I suppose I should remember these things, but I don't. There's a few more I've forgotten, and a whole bunch of, and the core fears, the core mental stuff. What I realised, I did a bit of research, this is a different subject, but I did a bit of research into what stops people performing to their highest levels, and it all comes down to hyperactive survival instincts. Right, that was it. You see how you have a survival instinct, that's survival instinct running in you, and you know, that reaction is your survival instinct kicking in as if you're in danger. I'm not very dangerous, but you're acting as if I'm a lion about to eat you. Do you get the idea? So everybody's got hyperactive survival instincts, and that's inherited from the First World War, the Second World War, the Cold War, and the 50 genocides of last century, if not something before that. And you know, 230 million people died last century from man-made violence. 230 million out of a population, let's say, of 5 billion. And at least 1 billion were traumatised by those other deaths. So we are the inheritors of enormous catastrophes. The biggest catastrophe is violence, the biggest orgasm of violence the world has ever seen, ever, as far as I can see. Ever, ever, ever. Because before it was always localised and small, you know, one tribe killing off another one. Last century, it was everybody killing everybody. So we are the inheritors of the greatest orgy of violence the world's ever seen. And the bottom line of all that is the hyperactive survival instincts, which are the foundation of all negative emotions. So we detox all that love as well. And we detox trauma of war and a few other bits and pieces. So we have 12 detoxes which you can listen to once a week, for one a week, with the idea of cleaning out or having a go at reducing the toxic load completely, which is the biggest problem in the West. It will go on from there, this website, but that's the fundamental level. It's called detoxdownloads.com, just so you know if you're interested. And we only launched it this week, so we're sort of still well, there's lots of, what's the word, enhancements and improvements to go on, but it basically works. I've tested it years ago, but it's taken me years to get it to be working. And, oh yes, today, Yatro rang me up and said, what was it you said? A relapsing cold that wouldn't go away.
Well, interesting. Peter rang me up actually, but
Oh, yeah, instead of come here. That's what
yes, but it starts a bit before that because I'd had a couple of colds that had finished, but it had hung on up here, and I was still coughing, phlegm, and feeling feverish, and it felt to me like there was a low-grade infection still there, and I thought, I can't live with this forever, I have to do something about it. And I just, yesterday morning, thought, maybe homeopathy, and I walked to the seed, and I saw Peter's poster. I mean, I knew he'd had a talk, but I wasn't going to come. And then he called this morning, and I told him this story, and he said, oh, that's, sounds like you've got TB in your constellation. I'll send you a download, which he did. And I said, I don't have time, I'm going to work. And he said, it only takes a minute and you have to have a conversation with TB. And I said, well, I don't have time for that either. And he said, no, it's not a normal conversation. Just play the file a few times and then come and tell everyone how you're cured tonight. So I thought, okay, it's only a minute. So I played it a couple of times, then I went to work and still had a bit of sneezing and so on. But I played it more since, but it does feel remarkably much better. I wouldn't say, I'm 100% cured or anything, I'll tell you tomorrow night. But it certainly feels, like I could always, generate something I could spit out, and I can't now. So, so I'm ready to spread the word and go on to my next set of symptoms.
So I'll tell you how my mind worked, you see. I know Yatro's just come back from India, and I'm sure leaving India behind and her extended family out there had some disappointments to it. And even if it's a small disappointment, I'm prepared to bet that she's had some major disappointments in her life which she hasn't resolved. The disappointments belong in the lungs. That's where they hit. And grief is felt in the lungs, and the disease which represents that is called tuberculosis. Now you can argue which came first, grief in the human race or tuberculosis, but I would argue that grief became a disease because it attracted tuberculosis in and it sort of married each other. So, and I know that she's long and thin, so I know that's a tubercular type as well, and she loves to travel and all this stuff, is my guess, and that's the tubercular type again. So I knew that I was onto roughly a winner. So then I knew that if I sent her this thing and she listened to it, there's a fair chance of getting a result on this evening, because this stuff sort of works, and I'm sort of accurate. I'm a bit more sharp than it looks. And so, yeah. So this detox system, so the problem I've always found is that homeopaths is a very sophisticated system, and it's very complex, and it's not so easy to operate. And I'm always trying to find a way of delivering it which doesn't require a personal approach. I know that seems a little unkind, but actually, why not? And what I realised was that the personal approach to homeopathy is only one option, and you don't need to go there. If you don't go there, you can go in an impersonal approach and it works just as well. Because I covered all the bases. I realised what personal homeopathy does, or constitutional. I did it for 30 years, I know what it's about. I've taught it all over the world. So that's like I know the stuff, and it's only one approach. And when I'd worked out all these different things that I'd worked out about how disease is formed, I realised I can cover all the bases without doing anything personal. Because actually the biggest delusion of the human race is that we are personal beings. We're not. These bodies that we operate through are impersonal, they're activated by something else. So the limitations of the body, there's nothing personal about it. You know, if I feel resentful, you feel grief, or you feel whatever, this is just inherited stuff. Just because I feel hatred doesn't mean to say I invent the hatred. My great-granddad probably invented the hatred, and I'm just trying to work it out for him. Well, it's nothing to do with me. I'm a walking history book of nonsense from the past. So it's not personal. However much we identify with this, and you know, we basically identify with this mind-body. It's not who we are. That's the fundamental. So I don't feel any qualms about saying I can depersonalise homeopathy and make it work better, which is what I've done with this latest website. And it will, when it's finished, be a complete system, just up to look differently. And I've got lots of other websites, which I'm not really thinking about, but I've got one called Natural Buddhas, which is for people who want to get to oneness. And I've got one called Max My Performance, which is for people who want to operate towards genius, who want to bring out their genius rather than sit there and not function properly. Because the dysfunctions that create diseases are the same dysfunctions that stop us being magnificent. And the thing about every human being is that they are magnificent and they're just living. They're living small when in fact they're amazing in potential. Every human being is potentially amazing. And we're not living this at the moment. We're living as if we're sort of dwarfs. So, and if you see an amazing human being, that's a person who's just beginning to emerge into what's possible, you see. And I mean, just a little example, one of my grandchildren, I've got lots of those, he's at 11 and he's doing AS level maths, just because he's had some private tuition. He's not particularly bright, he's bright enough, but he's not super bright. It just means the education system is appallingly bad. He's not getting what he needs to become great from the education system. And if, you know, it's just, that's how it is. And the medical system is the lowest common denominator in terms of health. Sorry, Peter.
That's why I left her.
And etc. So I think I'm stopping and I'm answering questions.
I have a question. Like you received some of these remedies through your connection, your conscious connection with your guide or whoever. Two questions about that. One of them is, do you get a bottle and then you just have one bottle and then you dilute that and use that, just that one, to make all the
Yeah. Once I've got a source, there's a homeopathic method of reproducing it, which seems to work very reliably. You know, we've made the AIDS remedies gone around the world thousands of times, not thousands, I mean, but hundreds of times, I would say. It's gone into all sorts of kits. It's been reproduced under almost ridiculous circumstances. If you go onto our foundation website called arhf.nl, you'll see all sorts of videos. If you want to find all the sites, you just go to